Hundreds of ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, while German submarines hunted them like wolves. You did not mishear that. So how did those convoys survive when the ocean was basically a killing field? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will see exactly how the Allies turned the ocean from a killing field into a moving shield. The Atlantic Ocean in World War II was not a backdrop. It was a front line that never sat still. There were no trenches you could point to, no mountain ridge you could circle on a map and call it the decisive ground. There was only open water, endless weather, and the constant knowledge that somewhere beneath the surface, an enemy could be watching without leaving a trace. And what was riding on that water was not optional. Fuel for aircraft and tanks, food for soldiers and civilians, ammunition, spare parts, medicine, radios, steel, rubber, everything that keeps a war from stalling. If that flow broke, armies did not just slow down. They ran out of the ability to move, to repair, to reinforce. The war effort could not simply push harder. It would starve. That is why the German submarine campaign mattered so much. It was not only about sinking ships, it was about turning shipping into fear, turning schedules into guesses, turning supply into a gamble. A submarine did not need to fight the most powerful warships to change history. It only needed to sink the right cargo ships often enough to choke the artery. And early on, the advantage felt brutally clear. Merchant ships were not built for speed or agility. They were built to carry weight across long distances. That meant they were predictable. That meant they were vulnerable. On a wide ocean, a single ship is a small object, but it is also an easy problem once it is found. One target, one approach, one strike, then silence again. Now imagine what that felt like from the deck. The sea is black, the wind is sharp, and every sound seems louder at night. The hull creaks, the engine beats like a slow, heavy heart. You stand, watch, and stare at water that looks empty, but you never trust it, because emptiness is what the enemy wants you to see. Then, without warning, the night changes. A dull thump in the distance. A flash that briefly sketches the outline of a ship you were just sailing beside. A column of smoke that rises like a signal flare no one asked for. And the worst part is that you still do not see the attacker. You only see the result. That is why sailors called it hunting. It did not feel like a fair fight. It felt like being stalked. So if the ocean was that dangerous, how did convoys survive? They survived because the Allies stopped letting ships cross as isolated targets and built a moving system that was hard to break apart. That system starts with a word people often underestimate: convoy. A convoy was not just ships traveling together. It was organization turned into protection. It was lanes and spacing and speed and rules that everyone had to follow, even when fear was screaming for improvisation. Because submarines thrive on two things: isolation and confusion. A convoy attacks both. Instead of one ship alone, a convoy moved as a group. Ships were assigned positions like seats in a theater. You were not free to drift where you wanted. You held your lane. You held your spacing. You held the speed of the whole formation, which was often slower than anyone wanted, because the convoy could only move as fast as its slowest ship. That discipline mattered because the ocean punishes stragglers. A ship that falls behind becomes a separate story, and submarines love separate stories. A ship that surges ahead creates gaps that ripple through the formation. A ship that turns on its own creates confusion, and confusion is how a submarine finds the easiest shot. So the convoy demanded something that feels almost unnatural at sea. Trust the group more than your instinct. Not because the group is perfect, but because the group gives you something the ocean does not give you when you are alone: a defended environment. And that brings us to the second word that makes convoys survivable: escorts. Escorts were the guard dogs of the formation. Their job was not to look dramatic. Their job was to make the water around the convoy hostile to submarines. They patrolled beyond the edges of the merchant ships, constantly moving, scanning, listening, reacting. The layer that turned a convoy from a bigger target into a defended target. The escorts also carried the burden of decision-making, because in the submarine war, every decision has a cost. If an escort chases too far after a suspected submarine, it can leave the convoy exposed. If it stays too close and plays it safe, a submarine might slip into position. If it attacks the wrong contact, it wastes time and reveals its pattern. If it delays, it might be too late. That is why escort work was exhausting. You were hunting something you could not always see in an environment that lies constantly. Waves create false shapes. Weather steals visibility. Night turns distance into a guess. Even your own ship makes noise and vibrations that can mask what you need to hear. So, escorts relied on procedures, patrol patterns, coordinated movement, underwater detection, and listening methods that could sometimes indicate a submarine presence. And when they believed a submarine was nearby, they attacked not only to sink it, but to pressure it. Pressure was often the real goal. A submarine needs time and position to attack cleanly. It needs to get ahead of the convoy, line up, fire, then escape. If escorts force it down, force it to evade, force it to lose its angle, the submarine loses the clean shot. Even if it survives, it may fail to sink ships that night. That is a quiet kind of victory, but it is the kind that keeps the convoy moving. Now here is where the story turns from mechanics into something more uncomfortable, because convoys did not only survive through technology and tactics, they survived through rules that tested people. When a ship gets hit, people go into the water. Freezing water, black water, water that steals your breath in seconds and your strength soon after. And the human instinct is immediate. Stop and help. Turn toward the cries. Pull survivors aboard. But in submarine waters, stopping can create more deaths. A stopped ship becomes a stationary target. A convoy that slows becomes easier to hit. A convoy that breaks formation becomes a set of isolated ships again. And isolated ships are what submarines want most. So convoys developed hard procedures about rescue. Sometimes a designated ship, if conditions allowed, would pick up survivors. Sometimes rescue would have to wait. Often the convoy had to keep moving, because the primary job was to keep the flow alive and deny the enemy a second and third strike. This is where I want to ask you something, because this is not a history question. It is a human one. If you were on a merchant ship at night, and you saw a ship burning nearby, and you heard voices in the water, and you knew a submarine might be watching the reaction, what would you do? Would you slow down and break formation to rescue immediately? Or would you follow orders and keep moving, trusting that rescue will come if it can? There is no answer that feels clean. That is why convoy survival was not only about courage, it was about restraint. It was about discipline under emotional pressure. And this discipline was not optional, because submarines were not hunting individual bravery. They were hunting patterns. They were hunting predictable panic. They were hunting the moment a formation breaks and turns into chaos. So, convoy commanders worked to keep the group from dissolving under stress. They used controlled signals, coordinated course changes, rules about lights and radio use. The goal was always the same. Do not give the submarine an easy night. But there was still a problem that made the Atlantic feel impossible, even after convoys became common. There were stretches of ocean where protection was thin, where escort numbers were limited, where air cover did not reach, where a convoy could feel alone even while traveling as a group because the nearest help was still far away. That was the gap every sailor learned to fear. The long stretch in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where land-based aircraft could not easily stay overhead, where the sky could feel empty for days, and where submarines tried to concentrate their effort. That is where the German submarines tried to turn one hit into a collapse. Out there, the war took on a different temperature. The sky looked the same. The water sounded the same. The ships still moved in their lanes, still held their spacing, still tried to treat the night like a routine. Everyone knew the truth about that part of the Atlantic Ocean. If something went wrong, help might not arrive in time. This was the kind of water German submarines preferred, not because it was calmer, but because it was lonelier. And the hunt started long before a torpedo ever left a tube. A submarine commander did not wake up and simply stumble into a convoy by accident. He hunted by building contact. He searched the horizon for a smear of smoke that did not belong to weather. He searched for the tiniest change in the surface, a shape that should not be there, a silhouette that flickered in and out of mist. At night, he searched for mistakes, because mistakes were visible: a cigarette ember, a single careless light, a ship that drifted out of lane for just a moment. And when a submarine found a convoy, the most dangerous thing it could do was not fire immediately. The most dangerous thing it could do was call others. This is how the pack formed. One submarine, shadowing at distance, sending a message, pulling in more boats from different directions. The convoy thought it was crossing empty water, but under the surface and beyond the horizon, the water was turning into a trap. Now put yourself inside that submarine for a moment. It is cramped. The air is stale. The smell is a mix of metal, fuel, sweat, and the ocean that clings to everything. Men speak quietly because sound feels louder when you are sealed inside steel. Every minute is measured. Every movement is deliberate. There is no room for panic because panic makes you sloppy, and sloppiness kills you. The commander watches through the periscope in short bursts, because staying up too long can reveal a thin, fatal line on the surface. He sees the convoy as shapes, a grid of shadows, moving steadily, carrying what the enemy needs. He also sees the escort ships, the ones that make his job dangerous. Those escorts are the teeth, so he chooses timing. Often, that timing was night. Night made the convoy tense and the escort crews exhausted. Night made distances uncertain. Night made the ocean hide what it was doing. And at night, a submarine could take a risk it did not want to take in daylight. It could run closer on the surface, move faster, position itself for a shot, then attack into a formation that was struggling to see clearly. Now, imagine the first strike. It does not start with a cinematic duel. It starts with a ship simply disappearing into flame. A torpedo hits, and for a split second the ship is still there, still moving, still alive. Then the explosion blooms, and the structure breaks in a way that looks wrong to the eye, as if the ship is folding instead of sinking. Fire climbs fast because fuel and cargo do not wait. Smoke punches into the night sky like a signal that screams, "Here we are." And immediately, every other ship in the convoy becomes a witness. You feel it before you fully understand it. A heavy thump through the water, a vibration through the deck, a pause in your own breathing, as your mind tries to decide whether that sound is distant or close. Then the smell arrives, burning oil, burning paint, burning cargo. And in the darkness, you see a ship that was part of your formation now lit up like a torch. This is the moment submarines want, because this is the moment human beings behave predictably. Someone slows. Someone turns. Someone breaks lane. Someone sends frantic signals. Someone forgets the rules. And the convoy starts to bend, which is how it can break. But here is the part that explains survival. The convoy system was built specifically for this moment. The convoy was built to keep fear from becoming movement, because movement is what creates openings. So a well-run convoy does something that feels almost cruel. It holds. Ships keep their lanes unless ordered to change. The formation stays coherent. The convoy commander issues a controlled response. Escorts react, but not all of them. Not in the same direction. Not in a way that strips the convoy bare. That is the ideal. But the ocean does not always give you ideal, because now the second submarine is coming in, and the third. And the danger multiplies in the worst way. You do not know how many attackers are out there. You do not know which direction the next torpedo will come from. You do not know if the first strike was a lone hunter or a signal flare for a pack. Escort commander has to make a choice in the dark. This is where the Atlantic became a test of judgment. The escort commander can chase the attacker aggressively. He can break away at speed, push toward the suspected position, and try to kill the submarine with depth charges. That feels good. That feels like action. That feels like control. But if he chases too far, the convoy loses its shield. And if the convoy loses its shield, the next submarine gets a cleaner shot. So the escort commander has to balance two instincts that fight each other. The instinct to punish the attacker and the instinct to protect the group. Protection first is not glamorous, but it is how convoys stayed alive. Now, let us follow one of these nights as it unfolds, because the logic becomes clearer when you feel the sequence. The first ship is hit. The convoy holds as best it can. An escort breaks off to attack, driving hard into black water, listening, searching, trying to find the submarine before it slips away. Another escort stays close, weaving on the edge of the formation, because the convoy does not just need revenge. It needs coverage. Depth charges drop, and for a moment the sea itself becomes violent. Water erupts upward in white columns. Shock waves travel through hulls and bones. The ocean looks like it is being punched from below. Even if the submarine is not destroyed, it is forced down, forced to evade, forced to lose the clean geometry it wants. That is pressure. And pressure is how you buy time. Now the convoy uses that time. The convoy commander may order a coordinated course change, not a panicked scatter, a turn that keeps spacing and lanes. A controlled bend, like steering a long train, because the worst thing you can do is have every ship improvising its own escape. Meanwhile, the submarine commander is making his own decisions. He knows escorts are dangerous. He knows the longer he stays near the convoy, the higher the risk. But he also knows the convoy is slow. The targets are real. The temptation is heavy, and if he has help coming, he may decide to stay in contact long enough to guide others into position. So he watches. He waits for mistakes. He waits for the moment the convoy's discipline slips, even slightly. A ship that hesitates, a gap that opens, a lane that becomes less tight. A ship that drifts toward the edge, just trying to put distance between itself and the fire, and accidentally becoming the cleanest silhouette in the water. This is why convoy discipline mattered so much. It was not only about surviving one torpedo, it was about denying the enemy the chain reaction. Because the pack does not win by sinking one ship. It wins by turning one hit into chaos, then turning chaos into multiple hits. So, how did convoys survive? They survived by interrupting that chain reaction. They kept lanes. They kept speed. They limited lights. They controlled signals. They refused to let grief and fear dissolve structure. In the dark, that discipline did not look like heroism. It looked like shadows holding a grid, even while fire tried to pull that grid apart. And the escorts, when they were effective, did not just chase submarines. They protected the convoy's shape. They defended the pattern. Now, this is where people often misunderstand escort work. They imagine escorts as pure hunters, always charging, always attacking, always trying to sink submarines at any cost. But in the convoy war, a submarine does not need to be sunk for the convoy to survive. A submarine only needs to be denied. If the submarine is forced deep, it becomes slower. It becomes less able to position. It becomes less able to attack again immediately. It becomes reactive. It has to think about survival, not just killing. So sometimes, the escort's job was to make the submarine spend the night escaping instead of aiming. That is not satisfying to watch in a movie, but it is effective in reality. And here is where the fight gets colder. Submarines did not win just by aiming well. They won by finding you first, calling their friends, and turning the ocean into a meeting point. So the Allies went after the nerve system of the hunt, contact and communication. They rerouted convoys, played with timing, and made patterns harder to read. And when submarines transmitted, the Allies worked to catch those signals, interpret them, and move convoys away before the trap fully formed. The moment a convoy suspects it is being watched, everything tightens. Escorts change posture, discipline sharpens, the approach becomes riskier. And then the war adds one pressure: submarines cannot ignore pressure from above. Because an aircraft does not need to sink a submarine to change the entire night. An aircraft only needs to appear. A submarine that is forced to dive loses speed. It loses visibility. It loses the ability to sprint into position on the surface. It has to manage power. It has to choose between stalking and surviving. When air coverage expands, the ocean becomes a smaller hunting ground for submarines. Not because the water shrinks, but because the safe ways to operate shrink. And that is where the story turns, because once the sky starts to press down on the ocean, convoy survival stops being only about enduring attacks. It becomes about reshaping the battlefield so that attacks are harder to set up, harder to coordinate, and riskier to execute. Before we move into that turning layer, I want to ask you something that sits right in the middle of this tension, and it is the kind of decision people still face in different forms. If you are an escort commander and you get a promising contact, do you chase hard to try to destroy the submarine? Or do you stay close and protect the convoy's shape, even if it means the submarine might escape? Put yourself on that bridge, in that cold wind, with that black water on every side, and tell me what you would choose. The turning point in the Atlantic Ocean was not a single explosion or a single heroic duel in the dark. It was something colder than that. It was the moment German submarines started realizing that the ocean was no longer theirs by default, because for a long time, the submarines had one priceless advantage: freedom on the surface. They could move faster, they could reposition, they could shadow a convoy and wait. They could coordinate with other submarines and build a trap. Night gave them cover, and open water gave them room. So the Allies did not win by making the sea gentle. They won by taking away that freedom, piece by piece, until the submarine commander's best option became survival instead of hunting. And the weapon that did that, more than anything else, was the sky. When aircraft became a real presence over the convoy routes, everything changed, even before a single bomb hit the water. Because a submarine that has to fear aircraft is a submarine that has to dive. And a submarine that dives becomes slower, blinder, and more limited. It cannot sprint. It cannot stalk on the surface. It cannot easily maintain contact for hours. It becomes a creature that is reacting, not choosing. That pressure alone saved ships. Now, imagine a submarine commander on a night shadow. He has contact on a convoy. He has been patient. He has called for others. He is thinking about timing, about angles, about which ship on the edge looks like the easiest victim. He believes the ocean is giving him the same kind of night it always has. Then a sound cuts across the water. Not a ship. An engine above. At first it is faint, and your mind tries to pretend it is nothing. Then it grows, and the tone shifts, and suddenly the submarine commander is no longer thinking like a hunter. He is thinking like prey, because aircraft do not need to see the whole submarine to ruin the attack. They only need to catch a glimpse. They only need to force a dive. They only need to make you lose position. And that is exactly what happens. The commander orders the boat down. The periscope goes away. The surface disappears. The world becomes steel walls, dim light, and a deepening pressure that you can feel in your teeth. Men move quickly, but quietly, because quiet is survival. The boat angles down and the water closes over it like a lid. Now the submarine is alive, but it is no longer in control of the night. The convoy keeps moving. The escorts keep their pattern. And the submarine, forced down, has to decide how long it can stay submerged at speed, how much power it can spend, whether it can regain contact before the convoy slides out of reach. This is the kind of shift that wins wars. Not because it looks dramatic, but because it repeats. Again and again, aircraft appear. Again and again, submarines dive. Again and again, convoys pass through what would have been perfect killing water with fewer clean attacks. But air coverage was not simple in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That ocean is vast, and early in the war there were stretches where aircraft could not patrol effectively. Convoys moved through those stretches, knowing that the sky might be empty. Submarines learned to wait for those gaps, because in those gaps, they could surface, move faster, and rebuild contact. So the question became, how do you put the sky over the ocean where the ocean is too wide? The Allies approached that problem from multiple directions. They pushed aircraft farther out with longer-range patrols. They brought aircraft closer by putting them on ships that could travel with convoys, including escort carriers whose entire job was to keep a small air umbrella moving with the ships below. And they improved the ability of both ships and aircraft to detect submarines, even when the submarine tried to hide. Think about what that does to a submarine crew psychologically. In the early war, the submarine commander could believe he owned the night. He could believe he could strike and escape with discipline and luck. As the war progressed, he had to add new fears. He had to fear aircraft appearing without warning. He had to fear escorts detecting him sooner. He had to fear that even one radio message might point someone toward his position. He had to fear being forced to dive and then being hunted for hours, listening to explosions in the distance, not knowing if the next one would crack the hull. So, convoy survival is not only a story about ships being protected, it is also a story about submarines being pushed into worse choices. Now, let us make this concrete, because this is where the Atlantic story gets brutally intense. Picture the convoy again, moving through dark water. The formation is holding. The escorts are moving on the edges, weaving and scanning. A merchant ship that carries fuel sits in its lane like a floating matchstick, and everyone knows it. Somewhere out there, a submarine finds the convoy. It tries to shadow. It tries to call for help. It tries to move into position. But the escort pattern is tighter now. The convoy discipline is sharper now. The escorts are not just reacting after a torpedo hit. They are pressing outward. They are hunting contacts. They are dropping explosives into the water, not always to destroy, but to warn. We are here, and we are looking. The submarine commander feels that pressure. He watches a path that used to be open become a maze. So he takes a risk. He surfaces at night to move faster, to regain position, to line up for a shot. And the ocean punishes him. An aircraft appears, low on the horizon, like a moving star that does not belong. The sound grows fast. The submarine tries to decide whether it can stay up long enough to fire or whether it must dive immediately to survive. This is the new reality. Every second on the surface is a gamble. The commander chooses survival and orders the dive. The submarine slips under, but now it is slower, and it is trying to catch a convoy that never stops moving. And while the submarine is diving, the convoy is doing something that looks simple, but is the core of the whole war. It is holding together. It is refusing to scatter. It is refusing to offer isolated ships. It is refusing to turn fear into openings. That combination of air pressure, escort pressure, and convoy discipline is what gradually strangles the submarine advantage. But the story does not end there, because the sea is still large, and submarines still have one powerful weapon: coordination. If a submarine can maintain contact long enough to draw others in, the convoy can still face a pack. So the Allies attacked the coordination itself. They worked to make convoy routes less predictable. They worked to interpret submarine movements and concentrate escorts where risk was rising. They worked to disrupt the cycle of spot, report, converge, strike, even when they did not have perfect information. Even when the ocean still hid too much, a small edge in prediction changes the odds. Because prediction is what makes the convoy feel less helpless. If the convoy commander believes there is danger ahead, he tightens the pattern. If escorts believe there is a threat zone, they push outward harder. Aircraft patrols are directed toward likely contact points. Submarines are forced down earlier. And the earlier a submarine is forced down, the less time it has to set up the perfect shot. That is the game. Deny time. Deny position. Deny surprise. Now we arrive at what feels like the moment where everything changes in the emotional sense, because this is when the convoy stops feeling like a victim and starts feeling like a moving trap. A submarine moves in to attack. An escort detects something wrong, not a clear shape, not a clean certainty, but a pattern that does not fit. The escort commits. The ocean erupts with explosives. The submarine dives deeper, twisting and turning, trying to evade. And then the hunter becomes the hunted. Inside the submarine, men hold their breath without realizing it. The lights might dim, instruments rattle, the hull complains. Water pressure squeezes the boat like a fist. Every explosion sounds closer than it is. Every explosion is followed by silence that feels worse, because silence means the escort is listening again. This is not the glamorous war of newspaper photos. This is fear in a steel tube. And if you ever want to see the public records and first-hand accounts that back up stories like this, I pin the source links in the description and the top comment so you can follow the trail yourself. The real shift is simple. The submarine commander can no longer assume he will get a clean second chance. Earlier in the war, a submarine might attack, slip away, and return again. The ocean was wide. Escorts were fewer. Air cover was thinner. The risk was lower. Later, after pressure from escorts and aircraft grows, the submarine commander has to consider a new possibility. If he commits to the attack, he might not come back. That changes behavior. It makes submarines more cautious. It makes attacks harder to coordinate. It makes commanders break off earlier. It makes the pack less effective. And every time a submarine breaks off instead of committing, ships live. Now, from the convoy side, that turning point feels like a subtle shift in the air. It feels like fewer nights where the convoy is slammed repeatedly. It feels like escorts becoming more confident and less reactive. It feels like course changes that are controlled, not panicked. It feels like a convoy that takes one hit, but does not collapse into chaos afterward. Because that is the real victory. Not preventing every hit, but preventing the chain reaction. So here is the cleanest way to say what changed in the Atlantic Ocean, without turning it into a lecture. At first, submarines had initiative. Over time, convoys took initiative away by layering pressure. Pressure from escorts that deny position. Pressure from aircraft that deny surface freedom. Pressure from routing and prediction that deny easy contact. Pressure from discipline that denies chaos. And once those pressures stack, submarine warfare stops being a hunt and becomes a gamble. Now, I want to heighten this with one last scene, because it captures the emotional core of why convoys survived. The convoy keeps moving through hell. A ship is hit on the edge. Fire lights the night. The convoy holds its lanes. The escorts surge outward. The submarine, forced down, loses position. The aircraft above drifts away, searching for the next shadow. The convoy does not stop. It cannot stop. Men stare at the burning ship as it falls behind. They feel the cruelty of it, and they feel the necessity of it. They understand, in a way that is hard to explain later, that the convoy is choosing survival over comfort. And that is exactly what keeps it alive. Because submarines cannot sink a system that refuses to break into pieces. And once you understand that, you start noticing the bigger picture hiding behind the explosions. You start noticing what the convoy war was really buying, week after week: time, momentum, and the ability to keep the entire war effort fed. And here is what that meant. Once you zoom out and stop looking at a single night, the Atlantic Ocean was not a contest of pride. It was a contest of endurance. Every convoy that arrived meant factories kept running, airfields stayed stocked, tanks stayed fueled, hospitals stayed supplied. Soldiers on the front lines got food, ammunition, spare parts, and the simple things that keep a fighting force from grinding down into exhaustion and desperation. A convoy that was mauled was a wound. But a wound is not the same as a kill, as long as the system keeps moving. That is the part people forget when they picture the Atlantic as a series of dramatic sinkings. The German strategy depended on breaking the flow, not just hurting it. The question was never, can they sink ships? The question was, can they sink ships faster than the Allies can replace them, and can they do it long enough to choke the war effort? And over time, the answer became no. Not because the ocean got kinder, not because submarines suddenly became useless, but because the Allies built a pipeline that could take hits and still deliver. They built more escorts, they trained crews, they improved procedures, they expanded air coverage, they got better at routing and prediction. They learned from losses in a way that turned pain into pressure back onto the enemy. That learning loop is what made the convoy system feel like it levels up as the war goes on. The enemy adapts too, but the enemy is adapting inside an environment that is getting tighter. The submarine commander who once expected open hunting water now faces a world where every choice has a shadow attached to it. Transmit, and you might be located. Surface, and you might be seen. Shadow too long, and you might be hunted. Commit to the attack, and you might not come back. So attacks become riskier, and risk changes behavior. When the cost rises, the number of clean opportunities shrinks. That is why the Atlantic story is not a single turning point you can circle. It is a gradual shift in who is allowed to operate freely. At the beginning, submarines operated freely, and convoys tried to survive it. Later, convoys operated with structure, and submarines had to survive the defenses. That shift is the heartbeat of the whole story. Now, let us talk about what this looked like on the human level when the system started working. It did not look like victory parades. It looked like a convoy taking a hit and not falling apart. It looked like crews hearing the explosion, feeling the fear, and still holding their lane. It looked like escorts reacting without panic, applying pressure, then returning to the convoy instead of chasing into the dark until the convoy was naked. It looked like a night where the submarine tried to set up, got forced down, lost position, and watched the convoy slide away like a train disappearing into fog. And for the sailors, those nights mattered because they changed something inside them. When you survive one attack, you feel lucky. When you survive multiple attacks with the same disciplined response, you start trusting the system. And trust is a weapon in this kind of war. Because fear makes you unpredictable in the worst ways. Fear makes you break formation. Fear makes you waste time. Fear makes you chase the wrong thing. Fear makes you do the dramatic move that feels right in the moment and gets people killed in the long run. So once sailors and escorts began trusting the system got stronger just by existing. The convoy became harder to break because the humans inside it stopped feeding chaos into the machine. Now, the German side felt this too. A submarine crew that spends hours trying to set up an approach, only to be forced down and driven off, comes out of that night tired and frustrated. A crew that survives depth charges learns that survival itself can become the mission. A submarine commander who sees escorts respond faster and more intelligently begins making safer choices. And safer choices often mean fewer successful attacks. So, the Atlantic does what it always does. It grinds. It wears down advantages. It rewards the side that can keep refining the machine. And that machine did more than protect ships. It protected time. Time is the invisible currency of war. Every week the shipping lanes stayed open, gave the Allies more time to build, more time to train, more time to expand escort forces, more time to increase aircraft coverage, more time to strengthen the entire war effort. Meanwhile, every submarine lost was not just a ship lost, it was an experienced crew lost. Training new crews takes time, producing new submarines takes time, and submarines, unlike merchant ships, were not easily replaced at the same pace in the same way. So, the long game favors the side that can sustain losses and still grow. Why convoy survival matters so much. It was not only a series of tactical successes at sea, it was a strategic success that fed every other front. If the shipping had broken, everything else would have felt different. The land battles that people talk about, the air campaigns, the big pushes, They all assumed that the fuel and ammunition and parts showed up. Convoys made that assumption real. Now, I want to land this story on one more hard truth, because it is central to the emotional reality of this campaign. Even when the system was working, people still died. Ships still burned. Cold water still swallowed men. And the convoy still kept moving. That sounds cruel until you understand what the convoy was actually doing. It was choosing survival of the whole over the comfort of any single moment. It was choosing to keep the flow alive because the flow was the war effort itself. That kind of choice does not feel heroic in the moment. It feels like loss, but it is also why the system could not be broken. Because submarines were not only trying to sink ships, they were trying to break the will behind the system. They were trying to turn pain into hesitation, hesitation into delay, delay into collapse. And the convoy system refused to collapse. It built procedures that could hold even when hearts were breaking. It built discipline that could hold even when fear was loud. It built layers that could hold even when the enemy was invisible. So, when you return to the original question, the answer becomes clear in a way that is almost simple. How did those convoys survive? They survived because they stopped acting like isolated ships and started acting like a coordinated organism. They survived because escorts learned to protect the convoy's shape, not just chase a kill. They survived because air coverage forced submarines into weaker positions. They survived because routing and prediction reduced surprise. They survived because the entire system learned and improved, turning each brutal lesson into tighter pressure. And then there is the last reason, the one you cannot measure on a map. They survived because people did the disciplined thing, repeatedly, even when it did not feel good. That is the value I want to leave you with, because this is where a World War II story reaches out and touches real life. Most people think survival comes from one big moment of bravery, one dramatic decision, one burst of willpower. Sometimes it does, but more often, survival comes from structure, from the boring, repeatable behaviors that keep you steady when the world tries to shake you loose. A convoy is a perfect example of that. On any given night, one sailor's courage matters. One escort commander's judgment matters. One lookout's attention matters. But what carries the group across the ocean is the system that keeps people from making the same predictable panic mistakes. And that is a lesson that translates cleanly. When life feels like open water, when you are tired, when the threats feel invisible and you cannot control everything around you, you can still control one thing: the structure you build for yourself, the habits you keep when stress rises, the people you stay connected to instead of isolating, the discipline to do the next correct thing even when emotion wants the dramatic thing. Because the enemy in your own life is often the same as it was in the Atlantic: isolation and confusion. And the cure is often the same too: structure and connection. That is what convoys were. Structure plus connection, moving forward through fear. If this kind of story is what you came for, subscribe to WWII Uncovered. I keep the original public sources in the description and pinned comment so you can verify details and go deeper if you want to. And I want to hear your call in the comments. If you were responsible for protecting a convoy, would you invest first in more escort ships close in, or more aircraft coverage overhead, and why?